For everybody who is here as a guest. We're glad you've come along. Perhaps you saw the article in the Barhead Leader, or maybe saw it on Facebook or Instagram, or maybe a friend invited you to come and meet this young couple, Kevin and Julia Garrett. They have an extraordinary story to share with you. They shared it today at Barhead Composite High School. So it was a great afternoon, almost a full house over at their theater of social studies students and English, and there were a couple other classes, I think, in there as well. We were over at the flower shop, selling books, signing autographs, and now here tonight. And it's really a great pleasure to be able to introduce Kevin and Julia to you. If you're not completely familiar with their story, you're going to know it when they leave. And I'm going to have Kevin come up in a moment to start us off. He's going to then have a video that will introduce you through 8 minutes to their life, and then they're going to come and share their experience of being in China. And it's great to have people from Edmonton here tonight. People have driven all the way out from Edmonton, St. Albert, Barhead. Anybody from Westlock? Nearlandia? All right, okay. Athabasca? Okay, Boyle? We had people from Boyle here on Sunday. Okay. How many from Barhead? All right, all the rest. Great. Well, please put your hands together and give a good Barhead welcome to Kevin Garrett.
I've heard anyways. Great to be here tonight. Very glad. Thank you for that Barhead welcome. I appreciate it. You didn't ask if anyone was from Vancouver. I would have raised my hand, but anyways. But it is great to be here tonight. And before I say anything, I want to say one thing. We could not be here tonight except that thousands and thousands of people around the world prayed for us. You really need to understand that. People prayed, and that's why we can be here tonight. And we're going to have time, a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers, so feel free to ask questions. We just ask them not too hard, but is that making a noise? And if you'd like to know more about what we're doing, we'll share a little bit about that in the end. We do have a book outside if you'd like to get that, because obviously even an 8-minute video or a 40-minute presentation cannot contain everything that went on in 2 years. So please take a moment and watch this video, and we'll be right back.
In August of 1984, Julie and I went to China to teach English, and we ended up staying for 30 years, getting involved in aid projects, working with churches and orphanages.
We just got married. We were 23, 24, and we met 2 different individuals who had both come back from teaching in China, and they just kind of dropped the seed there. And finally, the Chinese government invited us to come and teach English, so we went over to China. We really loved it. We set up kindergartens, orphanage, schools, training centers in very small towns in China.
Julie and I were arrested on August 4th, 2014. All these people came and grabbed us, separated us, and didn't see Julie for months after that.
I suddenly was taken by 2 men, and I remember thinking, who are these people? Like, where am I going? What's wrong? They supposed to be the wrong people. They must have made a mistake.
They took me to our apartment with about 18 security personnel. And then they proceeded to just ransack our apartment, taking books off the shelf, going through everything that we owned, like our children's binoculars. And they said, kind of like, this is spy material. Or they found a computer in a cupboard, and they said, you're trying to hide it. And this went on till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They put me back into the car, and they drove for close to an hour out of town. I ended up at this kind of remote compound, and through locked doors, they lead me into this room. There's a bed, a couple desks, and 2 cameras mounted on the wall. The windows were covered with very dark, heavy curtains, and that's where I spent the next 6 months.
The interrogation was hard, it was terrifying, but I just thought, okay, I'm here to love these people. So I'm going to try to serve them, I'm going to try to be kind, and I thought, this is their job. They think I'm a spy, I'm not a spy. We're both in a really awkward position.
They said, we're not interested in your Christian work. And so going through my mind, I'm thinking, well, then what could you be interested in? There's nothing else that we're doing here. I mean, we're running a coffee shop, we're working with an orphanage, we're doing aid work into North Korea. And I thought, well, this should be over really quick because we're not.
When I found out that the whole world knew and that there were so many people praying, I thought, aha, that's how the family of God works together at times like that. You're all alone, you don't know anyone's with you, you think nobody even knows you're there, but you're not forgotten.
They verbally threatened many times, threatened execution. They threatened to send me to North Korea. They said we could get 7 or 8 years in prison, but they never physically hurt me in any way. I didn't know how Julia was. I figured out after a while that she was in the same building.
Kevin was actually downstairs in the same building as me, and he realized that I went out for my walk around the outdoor courtyard right after he did. He started drawing little hearts with his boots, planted 2 boots like this to make hearts in the snow. And sometimes the guards would stamp them out, but sometimes I'd come out and there would be these little hearts in the snow. And we used like little ways like that to kind of send each other love messages, and I think that really helped us to get through.
The morning of February 3rd, they got up at my normal time, had breakfast, and it wasn't long after breakfast that they told me to pack up my things, and then we drove an hour and a half to the prison, and that was a whole new, well, experience really isn't quite the right word. It was a whole new level of imprisonment, of being detained.
My head investigator drove me back to my apartment and said, come down whenever you're asked, and don't do this, don't do that, follow this, follow that. Then the next 19 months was in that context for me and in prison for Kevin.
And I entered into that, huge building, big, thick gray walls, very tall, probably 20 or 25 feet tall, I'm guessing, and get put into cell 318. That had up to 14 other people in that cell, and that's where I stayed for the next 19 months. Once in a while, the investigators came back and they said, oh, it'll be over soon. And so, I fixed my hope on soon, but then soon became months, and they said, oh, it's been extended for another 6 months. And at that point, I would just, because I thought the time was almost up, I'm going to be released. That was Christmas 2015. And I hope it fell out. I guess you could say I felt just despair, because I thought, how can I do another 6 months? There was still no court date in sight. There was still nothing in sight. Inside the prison cell itself, it was about 12 paces long by about 5, not quite 6 paces wide. And when you have 14 people in that kind of space, it's crowded. Your bathroom is a glass-walled enclosure, maybe 2 paces by less than 1. Having glass walls and having cameras facing you all day long in that cell, and when you're in the bathroom is not, it's not pleasant. I guess I have to say that. The food cart comes down and they slop it in with a big ladle into a communal bowl. It's usually enough for 3 to 4 people to eat, so you eat in a group, and that's how we ate every day. All the way through, the consular officials kept telling me when they came that this is being raised at the highest levels, the government's working on this, and I had hope in that they were doing something, that it wasn't on the back burner, that when Prime Minister Stephen Harper came, he did bring it up with Chinese officials, that when Prime Minister Trudeau came, he brought it up at the highest level. For that, we're incredibly grateful. And then September 13th happened. They pronounced me guilty of espionage and spying, and they sentenced me to 8 years in prison. And that was upsetting. But the embassy official, when I was able to talk to him afterwards, he said, "It's okay, Kevin. We've been told that you could be deported as early as Thursday, but we won't know for sure until you're actually on the plane." I hardly slept that night. I think I was up much of the night just anticipating, is this really going to happen? Am I really going to be released? Or is it just another huge disappointment? And a little before 6, they came to get me. And we go in this 3-car convoy to the nearest international airport, which is about 3 hours away. And they get put on the plane as the very last passenger on a plane bound for Tokyo. As the plane door closed, our lawyer, he handed me a box of maple cream cookies and his iPad with pictures and messages from Julie and the kids on it. But it was just, I think the shock was just settling in that this is really happening. And when I got off that plane, border security officials met us and took us through a back way, and I walked into that room where Julie and my family were there, the kids were there. It was unbelievable and almost unreal.
And then the door opens and Kevin walks in with this massive beard and this huge smile, and everyone just rushed into his arms, and it was this giant hug. You don't ever want that moment to go away. You're just so happy and so thankful and so grateful.
I've been waiting for 775 days for that day to happen. It was an amazing and wonderful reunion on September 15th.
"775 days is a long time. But God knew every one of them. After those 30 years in China, we lived in 7 different cities. We raised our kids there. Our youngest daughter was adopted from China. And then God said, I'm going to give you 2 bonus years. And really, that's truthfully the way we look at it. It's not a punishment. It was awful, yes. But it was part of God's plan, and we see it as bonus. But people ask the question, why? Why did this happen to us? There's 2 whys. One, the Canadian government arrested a guy named Su Bin, a Chinese national living in Vancouver, because he was spying on the U.S. and stealing secrets, basically. And so that's what happened. They picked him up at the behest of the U.S. He was later extradited to the U.S. China took us because they wanted to trade. The problem is, Canada doesn't trade, and we're not spies. But that didn't matter to China. But there's a second, a far more, sorry, that keeps ringing. There's a far more important why. And that's God's why, right? The news says one thing, God says another. John 5:17 says, Jesus says, my Father is always at work, and I too am working. That's the other why. Because God's always at work, and He always will be. As we spent those 30 years in prison, we had an approach to working in China. And it's found in 1 Peter 3:15. He says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. We couldn't go into China and plant a church or be very open about who we were or what we did. But we could pray, and people ask questions. It's amazing, we shared this in Sunday school yesterday, when we pray, and things like, God, let them ask questions. People ask questions. It's just what happens. Because God is far more concerned about their soul even than we can ever be. And He knows who's hungry. That night we were taken, August 4th, 2014, what the video didn't say, I don't think, was 18 security people took me back to our apartment as they ransacked our apartment. How do I know it was 18? I was counting. I counted 18 people because they drove me I think it was probably 3 cars, and went to our apartment complex, and they went to the far gate, not to the close gate to where our apartment was. And I'm thinking, what are they doing? It's kind of weird. And they went to the far gate, and then the first guy to get out had a video camera. And so he's ahead of the whole group, and he wants to see everyone escorting me to our apartment down a back alley. And so I decided, well, I might as well count how many people are here for the party. And it was 18. And I thought, that's way overkill, right? But that's what happened. The end of the night, as you heard, I grabbed some clothes to Julie and I. It was about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And the one thing I did is I grabbed our Bibles. And the main guy who was ransacking our apartment said, you can't have those. And the Holy Spirit rose up in me and just said, well, that's not very nice of you. because it wasn't. But also because God knew we'd need our Bibles those 2 years. So from day one, we had our Bibles with us. And it was an amazing, incredible blessing. You know, Paul also speaks about prison. You know, when we read through the Bible, there's a lot of prison stories, right? He says in 2 Corinthians, this could be maybe another why. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the troubles and hardships we experienced in the province of Asia. I thought that was quite interesting when I read it. We are under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure. And really it was far beyond us to endure. People have said to us, how did you do it? And I said, not me, but the grace of God. So that we despaired even of life itself. And at points I did. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. That's the point. We can't do it on ourselves, by ourselves. But we can rely on God who raises the dead. Right? That's the point. Those couple of words, that we might not rely on ourselves. Because this was part of God's plan. And sometimes, and probably different times in your life, you've been at those points, I don't know what to do. I can't do this. And God says, I got you just where I want you. Trust me. Rely upon me. I know how to do this. Right? And Jesus said, in this world you're going to have some trouble. Right? Any of you ever had any trouble? Be honest. Come on. One. Okay. One honest person in the room. But what did Jesus say right after that? He said, be of good cheer, right? I have overcome the world. He says, I know what to do. I can take care of these things. We cannot. Those 775 days were long, and we cried out to God very, very often. And I wouldn't say very often. Some people say, you get up in the morning, you pray to God. For me, it was often, not every day, but every few moments, I was calling out to God, because it was just that hard. But the interesting thing was, God kept speaking and kept giving strength and kept showing His power and His grace and His presence. I read things like Philippians 4:7, a peace that surpasses all understanding. I understand what that is now, because I was not peaceful. I was incredibly unpeaceful. But when I prayed and asked God, that peace that didn't make any sense would come upon me. And it was real. The situation didn't change, but God changed the atmosphere. Or I read Psalm 46:1. He's ever present. What does it say right after that? Come on. In times of trouble, right? But I like the first two words. He's just ever present. Right? When we think about that, He's ever present means He's always there, right? And I had a lot of time to think about these words. And I think I've come to the conclusion what God really meant in these words. When He said in Psalm 46:1, He's ever present, He actually meant He's ever present. When He said in John 5:17, He's always at work, what He really meant was He's always at work. It's not hard. It's really easy. That's who God is. Julia's going to come and share.
So we're just going to invite you right into the middle of the story a little bit, so you can see how the things that Kevin just shared, how they applied in that context. And so first I will start at the dinner, which was really the abduction dinner. And at that abduction dinner, we didn't know it was an abduction dinner. We just thought it was a friendly visit with friends who were going to talk about their daughter going to study abroad. And so we had this dinner, and after the dinner we went down in an elevator, because an elevator in China, you heard a little bit about there, but I'm just going to go back so you can just sort of come more into the experience with me. Went down in an elevator. Chinese restaurants often have many floors, and the door opened, and that was suddenly when Kevin and I were rushed by a whole large horde
of agents. They were dressed in plain clothes, so we didn't recognize them. I originally said to Kevin, oh, I think it's a wedding. Let's move out of the way, until I realized they were rushing us. Now, in that moment, your whole mind begins to sort of have all these running scenarios going through them, right? First of all, you have this thought, like, this is not real. I'm going to wake up. This isn't happening to me. This is a movie playing somewhere else. It is not my life. And then you have this other thing, like, what about my kids? I have a son that's in this city. I'm not going to come home at night. What's going to happen to him? What's going to happen next? And all these things. And then, who is this abducting me? Is this thugs? Is this North Korean agents that are coming over and they're going to be taking us to North Korea? Is this sort of some mafia thing? Is this Chinese police? Really no idea. And you know how fast your mind can work over time when you're going through a crisis? Because it's sort of trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. But those of us who are Christians, who know that we have within us and carry within us the presence of God by his own gift to us. We have something else going on in our minds, and that is this, what I'm going to call right now just this sort of stream of consciousness prayer. This sort of connection to the Father in heaven that's going back and forth in prayer. Like, even though it's filled with desperation from our minds, it's also filled with this peace that passes understanding that comes from Jesus living in us. And so then I'm in this car, and Kevin, I didn't know he went back to our apartment for 2 years. I had no idea that he went back to the apartment, and I was straight in this car. I went to this local police station. Finally, I was like, okay, good, it's a police station. I'm going to go home. They're going to get it. They're going to say it's wrong. Then they walk out, and they say to me, they come in this room, this little tiny room, and they say to me, hey, 你是间谍. 我就不知道这是什么意思呢? Okay, so a little bit of Chinese for you. I'll translate. Means they said, you're a spy. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. You've got the wrong person. And they start stripping all my stuff, not my clothes, but I mean stripping everything I had with me, my rings, my necklace. They said, give me everything. Give me your purse. Give me everything you have with you. I had all my teaching materials from that day with me, big stacks of them. I kind of wished I hadn't because they had to itemize every one. And I reached in the purse, and I grabbed in the bottom of the purse, and in the bottom of the purse I always keep 4 pictures of my kids. We have 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. And I always carry them with me because they're always open doors to conversations with people. So I just reached in and I thought, they're coming with me. Whatever is going to happen next, they are coming. And I just clutched them. And they come over to me and they said, give them to me. And I said, no, please don't take my children from me. And there was something that just, again, as Kevin said, about when he was fighting for the Bibles, the atmosphere changed. And they just were like, okay, keep them for now. And then I'm thrown back in a car and taken out to a remote compound. And that compound, you heard a little bit about it in the video. But what you hear on a video and what you need to imagine if you're coming inside with me is walking past locked door after locked door after locked door in an empty white building to a final room at the end where you're put inside. And 2 guards are posted inside, and it's a very, very small room. And you're thinking, what is going on? I'm in this room, and nobody knows where I am, and nobody knows I'm here. They, in Chinese, call that a black jail. It means it doesn't exist. It's completely off the grid. Nobody knows where it is. The government didn't know where it was. They actually guessed wrong a few other times. They sort of tried to guess gradually, and they guessed wrong. Even our one son who was in China, he tried to figure it out. He said, it's probably this place over here or somewhere over here. And he went and he tried to find where his parents were, but he couldn't find it. It was way away from a possible place that anyone could find. And I'm in this room with these 2 guards. And the only thing that made a difference was that they had no idea that when they invited me there, they invited the Almighty God there. For that, we are thankful, because that made all the difference. And if I weep for people that are in prison abroad now, it is for that I weep the most. If they do not know him, how can they possibly survive what it's like? And it's still difficult, but it's different. Because we know, as Kevin just said, that our God is always at work. He always turns some things around for good. He always finds something. And what was he doing for me in that room? I lived there 6 months in that one room. Never went out except for when the embassy negotiated for a 15-minute outdoor walk, and you heard about the Hearts in the Snow, which happened months later because I didn't know Kevin was in that same building for 3 months. And I'm in this room, and these 2 guards are there, and I'm crying out to God every day, and the only break in the day was this: 3 knocks on the door, and going over to the next little adjacent room, the same size as my room there, to be interrogated by 3 officers. They sat there, I sat in a chair, faced them, fired questions at me about spying. We know your Christian work is just a cover. Why did you hide GPS chips in all the baby hats you were donating in aid to North Korea? I'm like, pardon? I didn't even know the Chinese word for GPS chips. I said, first of all, what is that? We know how you do it. You do that so you can track where all the hats go, so you can have secret intelligence to pass on to other people. I'm thinking, this is just out of, like, way beyond anything I ever imagined. And then they're saying, we know your son, why he's in Chinese university, and we're going to go pick him up if you don't sign here that you're a spy. We know he's studying to work for the Canadian government. That's why he's studying Chinese and writing academic papers. I said, no, he's not. He just also wants to work in China like us. He wants to do nonprofit work and help in China. We know the truth. You know, over and over and over. And what happens over time is your brain is forced down these sort of rabbit holes of minutia, like this. What did you do on June 14th, 5 years ago at 3:23 p.m.? Answer us. Now it sounds ridiculous. But in that situation, I thought, oh man, why can't I remember? And I would spend 10 minutes drilling my brain, trying to find which birthday was that closest to of my kids. Okay, where would I have been? Would I have still been teaching? Would I have been trying to figure that? We know what website you accessed on this day. Tell us exactly what that was. And why would you access that? Everything was to undo you and to wear you down so that they could get the confession. And people say, well, what were they trying to do? Why would you be writing thousands of pages of confessions over 6 months? And were they just trying to get you to write, you're a spy? No, they're just trying to unravel you with all sorts of minutia. So that then later, after those months have gone by of doing that, they come and the stacks on their table are getting higher and higher, because every day they've collected all these pages of testimony. So all of a sudden their evidence is like this big. And I look at it and I feel like it's that big too. I'm like, look at how much evidence they have against me. Strategy of working of a black jail. So by the time you're ever moved to a prison, that testimony is all gathered. That decision of whether you're innocent or guilty is really already made before you ever meet a lawyer, before you ever talk to anyone, before you ever get any input from your family. So you can understand what's going on in many, many countries of the world is just like that for people in those kinds of situations. Now, how did it make a difference that I was a Christian in there? And that was something they weren't counting on. And that was that I started to befriend them. It was as if the God in me loved them. I've read that in the Bible. You see, he does love them. I just had to clue into that. And as I did, I actually genuinely started to love them. Isn't that amazing? You know, when it says love your enemies and do good to them that persecute you, it wasn't like, oh, I've got to love them. It was this love is so deep and so strong and so real that you actually start to love. And so I thought, okay, first of all, I've got to make friends with them because they're the only people I have. So I have these 2 guards rotating on 8-hour shifts. Lights are on all night. So how do I do this? So I thought I'm going to give them English names. And then when they come in the room, I'm going to just say hello to them by name because they had numbers on. And then I went into my interrogation and I gave them names. And they heard, actually, from some of my guards. They said, I think she's given you names. I guess they told them at the dinner table, which I never went to because I had my meals right in my room. And they said, when I went into the interrogation, what are our names? I was like, oh, I named you Stephen, I named you John, and I named you Benjamin. Well, that was a huge, hilarious joke for them because Benji in Chinese means foolish chicken. So they thought it was great. So sometimes later down the hall, I'd hear them yelling, Benji, to him and like laughing because he was the youngest interrogator and he was also called foolish chicken by the spy. You see? God's love that comes out through us comes out in really interesting ways and different ways. But as they started to relax, I also started to relax, even though I was still facing interrogation. You know, one day I decided to write Thanksgiving notes to all my guards on Thanksgiving because I couldn't see my kids. I was like, will I ever hug my parents again? No, we're not right now. Will I even know if they're alive? No. Okay, these are my kids. All my guards are going to be my kids. And some of them are a bit too old for my kids, but that's okay. I wrote them little Thanksgiving notes on the back of scraps of confession paper. You know what? One guard came in, and they sit there, and they write in little notebooks. Julia stood up, Julia went to the bathroom, which is really embarrassing because it's right there with them in the shower, and they write it. That's all they're supposed to do is write the details of what I do in my room in all those hours while I'm waiting. Julia did her confessions, whatever it is. This day, I gave her a little note on a piece of paper folded over. And it said, I love your purple running shoes. They bring color into my room. Thank you. And she kind of was nervous to touch the note because maybe a spy would have some poison on it or something. I don't know. Like they were always super nervous of anything I did. And she flips the note over and she leaves it there. Now, she wouldn't even pick up the whole thing, but she sort of leaves it on the side of the chair. She reads it. And she just sits there. And I watch these little tears come pouring down her face. It's amazing. See? That's not in our human strength, is it? That we can do things like that or even imagine those things. That's how much God loves them. He wanted her to hear a positive word of praise. I don't know her family. I don't know if her parents ever hugged her or praised her, whatever her life was. But God knew all about it. And here I was just saying something like that. The next day I went into the interrogation because I wasn't allowed to directly give the thank you notes to the interrogators, even though I wrote them. And so I gave them to the head guard, and the head guard had given them to them. And I go into the interrogation room, and they're on their desks, standing up, because I folded them over like little cards. Are there 3 thank you notes? I said, thank you. And now we'll start the interrogation. You see? It's really interesting when we start to realize that God is always at work. How else would his love be revealed to them unless I was there? Do we ever think about that? When we're in the hospital for days on end, or when we're in a nursing home, or when we can't move, or when something tragic happens and we think, oh, this is so awful and annoying. If we pause and just think, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. And so I was actually amazed. And you know, I started keeping notes in my Bible because I had my Bible, and obviously I read it a lot. And I wrote notes in the back. I wrote this word, daily thanks, and I wrote a little note for every single day. And just to make myself thank you, just like a little picture I drew. And by the way, when they gave me the pen to write confessions, they always kept the pen cap. Because then they knew that I wouldn't have secretly hidden it under my covers or something and then used it to stab myself while I was sleeping. I don't know what they were thinking, but seriously, it even started to annoy me that they wouldn't give me the cap off the pen. And so I write these little notes in the back of my thing, daily thanks. And then in the front, I started writing month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, and I watched like how I was emotionally dealing with this. And by the time it got to month 3 and 4, I started writing, I'm starting to despair. The isolation is overwhelming. I don't know if my parents are alive. You see, the circumstances hadn't changed. I had no outside information. I was still going through the interrogation. I still had done those things, named them, and done all these things, and shared as much as I could with them what was in my heart. And the isolation still got worse and still affected me. So there's like days, I have a couple of days marked in my back of my Bible, and they're just like black. I put it black, but I put it black with little stars on because I thought, good, there's always hope in the black. But the black was also to remind me that I did have these very dark days when I just thought, I'm not going to get up off the bed. I'm just going to lie here. And it got like that. But you know what I found out about God? He saved gifts for those times. That's amazing. He had saved and planned in advance from when even before I was born, because all the days are known to him. He had planned, okay, I'm saving these little gifts for Julia for those darkest days. How precious that was. If my mom could have come and given me something, she would have, right? She would have bought my favorite chocolate bar and bought me some flowers or whatever. But God saved little gifts for me. And they were like, I heard a bird chirp. Or they were like, the window opened because they had to air out the window, and normally it was covered with opaque plastic paper and bars, and I heard a child laugh. It was like my favorite thing. I felt like all these gifts just came and came and came. And what happened was almost like the line between heaven and earth started to disappear. And that's something I never had experienced in the rest of my life. And I knew Jesus always said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and I just thought it's a really good, positive line, and it's powerful, but I never thought, he doesn't even see any line at all between heaven and earth. And the more I started to despair, and the more isolation I was in, the more it was like, God, I'm too lonely, and he's like, the three of us will come for the weekend, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I'm like, wow, good, whole community. The more real it got, the more intimate it got, the more personal it got. I'd have a dream of someone reaching down to hold my hand, or I'd be standing there and I'd see in the room as if I was standing with a whole group of people just singing together. And all these beautiful moments started to happen, and God started inviting me into a bigger story. And I started praying and interceding and just learning more about God in a most amazing way. 6 months came of that, and it had all those sides. And they said, we're taking you to house arrest because 6 months is the maximum in China you can stay in a black prison, in a black jail. And, otherwise you'd have to go to the public prison, but we're trying to vouch for you to be able to go to house arrest. And I said, oh, good, Kevin and I'll be together again. But I didn't know, because they don't tell you he was going to the prison. I said, can I just see Kevin once before he goes to the prison? And they said, fine, you can have a few minutes face-to-face across a table with all these guards standing there. And he tells me he's going to the prison. I'm like, no, you're not. No, you're not. We're going to call down heaven. We're going to pray. We're going to do everything we can. And I went back to my room. And shortly after that, I looked at the window. And there coming down the window were these little 2 drops of water. And I really heard God's voice say, I'm sorry, Julia. That's the Comforter. He shares our suffering. He didn't solve the problem right then. But he was saying, I'm sorry. And it was a sunny day, and these drops of water. And so that's why we called the book 2 Tears on the Window. It has actually multiple layers of meaning, but one is he shares our suffering. The other is how much we love China and still love it. And so even though this all happened, we had to leave, it still leaves us with some great sorrow. And the other is, 2 tears of joy that come from going through any experience in our life with him. Makes it all what Kevin calls our bonus years. Thank you.
I remember very clearly after those first 6 months being told I was going to be taken to the prison. 900 inmates, 100 were women. I remember as we were driving there and praying, God, not prison. I had seen very bad movies about prison. I didn't want to go. And I was really begging and pleading with God. And yes, he could have, set me free. And I had dreams of that. I thought, God, you've done it before. You remember that guy, Peter? You just kicked him in the side. He woke up, prison doors open. I think, we could do that. But God said, I can do that. He said, that's not your story. That was Peter's story. He had a different story in mind. And when I got to that prison gate and they took me in, There was no sign over the gate. But it should have said, or could have said, you are now entering hopelessness. Because in a Chinese prison, it's all about punishment. It's all about making you feel useless and hopeless. As I got into that prison, they put me in cell 318. 14 people in that cell. I met people who had been there for days, weeks, months. I met one guy who had been in that prison for 6.5 years. In prison in China, in that kind of situation, you don't see your family until you've gone to court and you're convicted. 6.5 years, no contact with his family. They try to make you feel hopeless. We had the privilege of seeing the embassy, an embassy official, once a month for 30 minutes. Could never talk about the case, but they could ask, are they feeding you? Are they beating you? They brought books because they pushed that I could have books. Once a month for 30 minutes, then I would wait 29 days, 23 and a half hours until the next visit. One time, I remember they told me, I would get messages from family. They said, your father's had a stroke. I had to wait a month to find out how he was. I entered that prison cell, and it's just wooden boards on metal frames with very thin cotton pads on them. And heads are all, when you sleep, your heads face into the aisle because someone walks up and down all night, making sure you're whatever, I guess, not doing anything. All food in prison has to be purchased. It means money has to be put on my account so I could eat in prison. Want a toothbrush? You have to buy it. Toilet paper, water to drink, everything has to be purchased in prison. Interesting thing is that 28.4% of the time, there's no food to buy. And you're wondering, how did you know that? How do you know that exact percentage? My first visit from the embassy was a couple weeks after I entered that prison. And I said, well, we don't get fed all the time. He says, well, how often? I said, I'll tell you next month. I had a pen and paper, and I started keeping track. And I kept track for the next 18 months. It was always 28.4% of the time. So they're very consistent. Lights are on 24/7. Guards, cameras, of course. Lots of rules in prison, like shaving. This is, it's funny now. It wasn't really funny then. But you can't shave in view of a camera in prison. And they keep your razors separate, not blades, they're electric. And I had one. So what happens when you shave, and you don't get your razor all the time. You get it once a week, twice a week, depends when the guard feels like it. And so you have to go outside. There's an outside area, a little, what we call the cage. And it's the same size as the cell, but it's just a cement pad with a cage. And you go out there, and you line up along one wall, because the camera can't see there, and then you can shave. So it's really funny. They just don't want a record of you shaving on the camera. So for whatever reason, I have no idea why, but that was the rule. Or the time they banned pens. For a while, some people could have a pen and paper. So I had that for most of the time, and I literally wrote hundreds of pages of notes and what God has spoke to me. So then they banned pens, and I thought, oh no, this is awful, banning pens. But the guards figured out they didn't ban the pen refills. So we could ask for a pen refill, and that was okay. Makes no sense to me either, I know. So we would take paper and roll it around to make, the cover and things like that. But people are human still in prison. And I remember one guy, when I first got there, he was the cell leader. And I'm just looking around before I say this. But he didn't have much hair. But he had a great comb over. Like you know what I mean, okay? And he was very conscious of it. So you're not allowed to have a mirror in prison. But what they figured out was you could take the foil from a wrapper of some food, and you take the thin layer off, and if you wet it, you can stick it on the glass, and it acts like a mirror. And I noticed that he would go often to look at himself in the mirror. I thought, okay. So one day I just thought, he's going a lot of times. So I decided I would count one day. How many times does he actually go and look at himself in the mirror and make sure his hair is in place? I counted over 60 times before I stopped. Because sometimes you just want to look your best, I guess, in prison. I don't know. I had time to read in prison because there's nothing else to do. God would wake me up at 3 or 3:30 every morning. It started out at 4 or 4:30, and then I kind of said, God, that's not enough time. Because everyone else, the bell goes off around 6 o'clock and everyone wakes up. So then God started waking me up at 3 or 3:30 every morning. And I would just have time to read and to pray. But when I first got to the prison, this one guy, and I wasn't really happy. I had prayed, I said, God, not prison. And so I got there, and this one guy, we called him Henry in the book. And he said to me, Kevin, everything's in Chinese. I'm the only foreigner in the prison, the only Caucasian. And Henry says to me, Kevin, just think of this as a long holiday. It didn't work for me. But a little while later, because people notice when you get up at 3 or 3:30 every morning, the lights are on, and Henry says, I think God's giving you a chance to study. So that made more sense. God's seminary was just a little different than my idea of seminary. But a few months later, as he was being sent off to the big prison, because he was convicted, because they have this little interesting statistic in China. They have a 99.9% conviction rate. So you're arrested or abducted, you're guilty. Doesn't make any difference. But Henry said to me, Kevin, I want to believe like you. What was John 5:17 that I just said a few moments ago? My Father is always at work. Psalm 46:1. He's ever present. You see, even in that prison, I didn't stand on my little wooden bed and preach to people, but I prayed the same as I prayed outside. I said, God, let them ask questions. And Henry asked questions. And before we sent off to the big prison, he wanted to know that God that I believe in. He says, I want to believe like you. There are lots of different stories. And I kept seeing God at work in that prison. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fun. It was actually quite inconvenient. You can imagine, right? Prison is inconvenient to you. But I kept seeing God at work, and I realized very quickly there's a purpose in this. He has a plan and a purpose, and he wants people to come to know him. That's God's greatest desire, isn't it? And he wants to use us to do that. But our thing is, we have to choose to join him in what he's doing. We have to choose to be part of it. We could sit there in prison and say, oh, woe was me. And sometimes I think all of us probably say that in one situation or another, right? But God says, join me. I'm present. I'm at work. Join me in what I'm doing. And it's no different in prison than it is in Barhead. I don't mean this is the prison. You understand that, right? I mean he's at work. He's the same God. He's no different. Paul says in Philippians 1:12, he says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. You see, Paul wasn't a prisoner of Rome. We were not prisoners of the Chinese government. We were prisoners of Christ. And God had a plan to go into that hopeless place and share Christ there. In those 19 months that I was in that prison, I met all sorts of people. 80 or 90 people came through my cell. Some stayed for hours, some months, some just weeks. But God had a plan because, with a captive audience, God always has a plan. And he did. So I had thieves come through. They had stolen money from whatever. I had mafia members come through. I had a lot of drug addicts come through my cell. I had 2 or 3 who are going to be executed come through my cell. And God had a plan and a purpose for every single one of them. And that really was that they would know him. And it was my choice to join him, yes, in my pain, for what he wanted to do in their lives. So one time, this inmate came to me, and people didn't come every day, but they would often kind of look around, then come over and sit beside me and say, And this one guy says, you remind me of my mother. Would that concern you? It concerned me. But then he said, you talk about that Jesus like my mother. Can you tell me about him? He didn't want to know when he was outside of prison. But when he was in the hopelessness of a Chinese prison, now he wanted to know about Jesus. How could that happen unless I was there? Or one time the warden came by. And she didn't come by very often, but she's older woman, well, not too old, in her 50s, I guess, but very stern. Are there any stern women here? Never mind. Okay. But she looks in the cell, and she says, "Can we go?" And she talked just like that. Okay, so I don't mean to throw the sound off, but she talked like that. And then I kind of look around and say, like, yes, I'm getting a little concerned. And she said, "I see you're reading your book," meaning the Bible. So now I'm getting more concerned. What's she going to do? And then she says, "That's good." But you got to really understand what she's actually saying. There's guards with her. There's a couple of prison cells nearby. They all heard what she said, that reading the Bible is good. How else could you proclaim to all those people in prison except through somebody like the warden who you have to listen to? So that word gets around. God put me there for that purpose too. And there were, you understand, prison was not on our bucket list, right? We didn't say, I'd like to try that one time. If you're thinking about it, don't, okay? But there are so many times that God just kept showing up. One time there's a drug addict beside me, and this is his 5th time in prison. Never quite learned, right? He'd only been released from prison 50 days before. Then he's arrested, back in prison. He'd already spent a dozen years in prison. He goes to trial. Guess what? You know the answer. He's convicted, right? Then they sentenced him to 15 more years in prison. He was in very rough shape, and he knew he would probably die in prison. Then he turned to me, and he says, "Can I read your book?" At that point, I had a Chinese Bible with me. If that Bible's still there, I don't know. But he wanted to read that Bible because he knew everything was hopeless now. But he realized there's hope. And somehow it's related to that book called the Bible. Because God does those things, and he keeps doing them. Another time there are times I felt despair. I just felt I couldn't go on. I remember being let out into the cage one day. It wasn't a shaving day. We were just let outside. And I went to the bars at the end of the cage, and I just said to God, I clung onto the bars, I started crying, and I said, "God, I can't do this anymore." And I looked down right in front of me, and there was a bright yellow dandelion amongst the dirt and grayness of this prison. Just one single bright dandelion. And all of a sudden I knew again that God was there. Nothing changed, but I just knew God put that dandelion, that bright yellow dandelion there for me. The atmosphere changed. The situation didn't. And God just kept reminding me of these things again and again, that he's at work. He brought me encouragement. He brought people along my way. And sometimes he brought humor. I'll tell you, this story is it's sort of funny, but not for the guy involved. So, in prison, you heard on the video that they bring food to the door, and they just kind of slop it in. You don't go out to a cafeteria, nothing like that. You hold a bowl under this little opening, and they just dump the food in. So, meat was kind of a rare thing in prison. And of course, you have to pay for everything. And if there's meat in the dish, you have to pay more, even though it might be microscopic. So when it was my turn to buy food, because we always ate in a group of 3 or 4 people, and I just decided, I'm going to ask for more meat. So it was my turn to buy food, and I go up and put my bowl there, and I said, "Could you just put a bit more meat in?" And the guard says, "Okay, give the foreigner some more meat." So, a couple little small pieces go in. And my group's really happy. He said, "Kevin, do that again," So this goes on for a few weeks, and every time it's my turn to buy food, they say, "Ask again, Kevin." So it happens again and again, and after a while, and we're getting used to this, like, we're getting this is nice treatment, look, that's a little piece of meat, look at that, But then one day I go as usual to ask, same guard again, and I said, "You just add a little bit more meat in." And he turns to me, and he laughs, and he says, "No." I thought, oh, my welcome worn out or something? This happened a couple more times within a few days, and then he died. Yeah, that guard died. Another guard came on duty whose job was to help hand out the food. Rumor gets around, okay? And it's my turn to buy food again one day, and I go and I ask for extra meat, and I see just kind of a little bit of fear in the guard's eyes. And he says, yes, give him some more meat. There's a little bit of superstition in China, okay? So, sometimes God does things. It wasn't really funny at the time, but it was like, especially not for the guy who died. But I just kept seeing God at work, and God being present, and doing what God does many, many times. I think we have a few more minutes, but I want to share a couple more stories. They're really just God at work. There's just God at work. And I was reading one day, and I came to Daniel, book of Daniel. I was reading in there, and I read in Daniel chapter 10, verse 2, and it says, "I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks." Okay, I'd been more than 3 weeks. "I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all till the 3 weeks were over." And God seemed to say to me, "You should fast for 3 weeks." Well, I thought I could do it like Daniel. There's no choice food. Actually, we had no choice of food, and at times no food, so it should be, easy to fast. So I decided, okay, I'm going to start on, and this, your thinking goes funny when you're in prison, okay, after a while. So I think I'm going to start on March 1st. This is a few days towards the end of February. I'll start on March 1st because I can do the math really well. 1 to 21, that's easy, right? I can figure out how many days I've fasted. Well, March 1st comes along, and for some reason, they serve something reasonably nice that day. So I said, okay, I'll start tomorrow. The math will be harder, but I can do it. I didn't actually end up starting till March 4th. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but you're like, why did I do that? So I start fasting, and about 10 days into this fast, now the prison does not like this, okay? They think I'm on a hunger strike, and I tried to explain, no, I'm not. And about 10 days in, I had this thought, I think I could eat a boiled egg. And you got to understand, it's really difficult to get a boiled egg in prison. Once in a while, we could order them through the guard, but you have to order them in bunches of 50 or 100. Okay? I know. So the whole cell has to agree, right? And you would split them up and you buy so many. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm fasting, I'm not going to do that. That day, the first and only time in 19 months, the guard came by selling boiled eggs. And I just thought, God, how amazing are you? Because for whatever reason, God just said, I know what you need. And so that day I had a boiled egg. I want to end with this. The day of my trial was April 20th. I had 3 days' notice. I'd been sitting there for months and months and months. 14 months total in that prison before my trial. 3 days' notice. I got up as usual, opened my Bible to where I was reading, and in my morning I had a routine. Always started in Psalms, always moved to the Gospels. Then I go back to the Old Testament, and I go back to other books in the New Testament, and I go back to the minor prophets. I always had a routine because I had hours every morning to do this. So open my Bible to where I happen to be reading. There's no happen to be, right? And I was at Psalm 23. Verse 4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what? I'll fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. God just wanted to say again, I know what's going on today. And I felt God's tangible presence beside me. But maybe he thought I didn't really get it. Because I opened up a devotional book that I had a short time later, and the title for that day was Not Guilty. 99.9% conviction rate in China, and God just wanted to tell me, you're not guilty. Again and again, that happened. Things like that happened. You heard in the video I was pronounced guilty, but God had already said, you're not guilty. But you're here for a plan and a purpose. Now Joseph, remember at the end of his life, he had spent a little bit of time in prison too, right? His brothers come to him, and what does he say to them? Genesis 50, verse 20, he says, you intended to harm me, but God meant it for good. You know, God meant every one of those 775 days for good. He meant every one of those 18,640 hours for good. Do you want to know the seconds and minutes? I will tell you. He meant every one of them for good, because he always does. God chose us to spend time with the Ministry of State Security. He chose me to spend time in that prison because he had a plan and a purpose, and he wanted the light and life of Jesus to go into that place. And I had to choose to join him in what he was doing. Yes, it was painful. Yes, it was hard. And I don't want to repeat it, but I don't want to change it either. I wouldn't want to change it. One last thing. Not long after I was deported, convicted and deported, someone asked me kind of an odd question. They came up to me and said, so, what'd you learn from this experience? My simple answer was, the Bible's true. And that's it. God is who he says he is. God does what he says he will do. Always. Yeah, we're going to have some light and momentary troubles, right? But God is who he says he is. And he meant every one of those 2 bonus years for good. And he meant that that's only chapter 1. You know, when we came back, God still had more plans. Julie's going to share just a little bit about that. But just remember what John said. Lord, you have the words of eternal life, because the Bible's true. Mm-hmm.
And so we were back in 2016, and now it's 2020. And I think we can't end the story with just telling you how amazing it was to learn who God was in those situations. But also to say, what about since then? And a lot of people said, so now what are you doing? And when we came back, we got all kinds of really unusual job offers because everybody assumed that we would just definitely want to stay in Canada for the rest of our lives since we'd had that experience. But part of it is we learned to trust and obey again and do whatever he called us to do. And I think that's the most important principle of all. And as we did that, we reunited with our kids, and it was so exciting just to share our stories and to see, and our parents all lived through it, which is amazing because they were all in their 80s. We got to hug them all again. You know, we had all these lovely family moments, but we still felt like displaced people in Canada. We'd never really lived in Canada for a long time. We didn't have a home, we didn't have a car, we didn't have anything. I remember going into the back of a church at the very beginning and sitting there, and I was like, oh, I hope no one asks me what I do. And you know, just crying because I thought, I don't fit in here. I'm used to just being among displaced people or among the poor or setting up nonprofit projects. And then through an amazing meeting with somebody, we ended up stepping into another open door and being able to go back to another country in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, And we're really very excited. And we first thought, well, we don't speak the language. What's it? You know, it's going to be hard. We're not that young. Are we going to be able to learn the language there? But the prison experience opened the door, because when we met the man the first time, he said to us, one of the men we were going to be working with, he said to us, "Hey, welcome. You're not zoo visitors. You get us. Our nation's been in prison for more than 60 years. And even though you've only been in prison too, come on in. You can understand a little bit of what we might be feeling." And not only that, we spend half our time between there and in Canada, because we do have a lot of opportunities to just try to share and encourage people in their own lives here in Canada, and we've been able to be in some other countries, to just persevere. Realize God is saving stuff still that you haven't seen about his character. There's more for you, whatever you're experiencing, the suffering you're going through, the brokenness, the relationship crisis, whatever it is, there's more. And I think if there's anything, we also want to be part of sharing our story with the hope that that would somehow encourage somebody else in their journey right where they are. And so the name of the organization, it's really just Kevin and I and our one son, and then a bunch of partnerships with people that we've met over the years. We called it Nation to Nation, and it's not Canada to the other nations. It's this partnership of nations together, working together, reflecting hope from one to another in a way that is mutually beneficial and can help people. If I have skills that one God has given me throughout my life, here they are. I'll share them freely. And as I'm doing that, I'll learn something about you. And so our motto here is hope that changes lives, because it truly does. And so what I learned from that experience in China, I wouldn't trade it for. I now belong to a new community of people who've suffered, and so does Kevin. I'm really thankful for that privilege, because I wouldn't have understood the lives of so many people in other countries and what they're going through without going through this myself. And I think we can turn every circumstance in our life around to something amazing. And so we have just came back from there a couple of weeks ago, and we took these lights, little sun lights. They're really bright. I'll show you them. Just you want to see how bright they are. There we go. Solar-powered little lights to these jungle villages right in inland Myanmar. Very difficult to get to, bumpy roads through the jungle. You know, we're out there. We took a team of people, amazing group of people in there. They were like just troopers. And we went in there, and we're just giving these lights to kids, and one per family, so that these kids can study, so that they can have education. What are these kids at risk of? Trafficking, drugs, because there is no opportunity for them without any education. There's no way. Their land is often being raised by different infighting, conflict, and violence. And we take these little lights, and we give them to them, and they can wear them. They walk them around with them on there, like this, running around in the day, so as long as they have them on this way. And they charge up. We gave them some water bottles, but before that, we also put in water systems. They'd never had clean water in their life. That alone will change the success rate of them, just the opportunity for them to live more than 5 years old. And I mean, just these little tiny things that we can do can change and transform lives. But the biggest thing is really the message of what is the light in our heart when we reflect hope, and we're doing it. And so when they ask us, hey, why did you bring us these lights? We want you to have the best life you possibly can. We want you to be able to go to school. We don't want you to listen to the drug addicts. We don't want you to be trafficked like your brothers and sisters and half the people in your village. But we have something else to offer, and that is the hope that is in your heart. And I remember just sharing it and thinking, wow, from prison, what I can share is deeper than ever because of prison. So we just give thanks. And so we just wanted to share that little piece of the forward story so you can just have a glimpse of what God's done after that experience. Thank you.
I asked the Garretts if you have questions, if there might be a bit of time. So if you have one or two questions that you'd like to ask, maybe I'll bring you back up in anticipation that there might be some. So is there a question that someone would like to ask before we head off tonight? Yes.
Can you tell us what your children, where they are now, and what they're doing?
Okay, so our youngest was 17 when it happened. And right now, we actually have a daughter in Edmonton. That 17-year-old is now 22, so she lives in Edmonton. She's working here. We have a daughter who was in Edmonton at U of A and now is in Australia doing her PhD. We have a son who's in Uganda. He's just coming home, but he's one who's also working with us in Southeast Asia. And we have another son who lives in Vancouver. And yeah, so they're all grown up. They're not like little anymore. Yeah, so what happened, even our son that was in that same city at the time, he didn't know anything about it because he stayed overnight at a friend's house that night. And then the next day he got a phone call and said, I saw your parents in the news. So he only found out that way. And so, yeah, he called his older brother and he said, hey, like, did you hear anything about mom and dad? Are they home? Like, what happened? And he's like, yeah, it's all over the news, BBC, every single news agency. So they actually heard like that. Now, when I got out in house arrest, so I asked them, can I please phone my parents and phone my children and talk to them? So they made a way for me to have conversations with them. They also allowed our younger son, the son that was there, he could come to the apartment and see me. So I did get a lot of information during that period. What I was limited in was I couldn't go back to Canada, and I really didn't have much interaction with all our Chinese friends and the different work that we had been doing there.
Yes?
I'm on medication, and one time I didn't take my heart pills for 3 days and I felt it. Now I often wonder what do they do in those countries when they can't get medicine to help them out.
Well, I was in a medical ward in the hospital. They do give medicine. They don't deny it. So I was on medication also, and they made sure I had it as well. And the other inmates would get medication that they needed as well. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I noticed when you talked about prison, you used what many of us would call euphemisms, which makes me think that you folks you have a rare perspective among Canadians. So what questions should we be asking about Canadian-Sino relations? Because obviously we don't know as much as you know about the whole situation and the back and forth.
What questions asked about Canada-Sino relations? There are many questions, and I'll give you an example of something. You know, what was going on in the media about us is not the same thing as what was going on behind the scenes with us. So the government was actually quite active in talking to the Chinese government, but they can't put that in the news because that will jeopardize what they're doing. So, you know, there's 2 other Canadians in prison right now, 2 Michaels. So what's in the news these days is far more than they put in the news about us. But they're doing more than what you see. I think you have to realize that. China wants something from Canada. They want Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, to be released. They took those 2 Canadians and 2 Michaels, the same as us. It's called abduction diplomacy. And they just want to put pressure on Canada to do that. But yeah, I'm not sure what other question to ask. Maybe Julie.
in a broader perspective, the rise of China as a strong superpower is probably something for us to ask questions about. What does that look like? What does it look like about the network, Huawei network coming here? Why have we not said no, yes, or no or yes yet? What are the implications of that? How could we actually help people? Because we have quite a passive approach, a very slow diplomatic posture towards releasing hostages and towards solving some of these overseas situations. What can the average person do? So one is pray, and the second would be write letters to the government, because the more stacks of letters, the more it has to be dealt with. So I think there's actually great value in you writing ongoing letters saying, hey, I want to get I want you to see your action on getting the Michaels out of prison. The problem is some of the things that the two countries are fighting about, they both have not been able to reach viable solutions yet. And so those would be other conversations that we could have personally that we may not want to mention publicly, but there is a lot of other information that you do not know, and it isn't what is reported in the news. And the government is much more active than they may appear, and that was a benefit to us, even in our case. They told all of our family, please don't talk to media, please stay out of the media, not because the media is the enemy, just because they were afraid that the media's interpretation of talking to a family member who also doesn't have all the facts could produce something that maybe would be inaccurate and anger China, so that all their steps to move ahead with their diplomatic posture would actually take 5 steps backwards. And I think those are the things that now we're aware of. And we've had a lot of discussions with different people from the government on some of these policies and issues.
Maybe one more question?
Yes? Chinese, Mandarin. Yes. We lived there for 30 years. We had to learn something.
Please give him a good hand. Thank you, Kevin and Julia. It was probably back in November that I was connecting with Kev and Julia about coming to Barhead in February. Kev said they were available to come on this weekend. So I'm kind of selfish. I look forward to being with Kevin and Julia. I really do. So having them come to Barhead was awesome. We spent time this summer at a camp in Manitoba. We were speakers at the camp and at North Point Church. And everywhere we go, we seem to bump into you. Jocelyn and I arrived in Victoria, and you were waiting for somebody else. And when we got off the plane, who's there? Kevin and Julia with their hugs. So that was quite something. You know, I'm not sure about you tonight, but when I listen to Julia, she makes me cry. But then she makes me laugh. When I listen to Kevin, he makes me laugh. And then he makes me cry. I'm not sure if you understand what I mean about being in the presence of greatness. Right? It's a rare thing, and you feel it and you know it when you're there. I feel that every time I'm with them. And I hope you kind of felt that way. You talked about perspective of seeing things. If you're in prison and what Kevin shared with you is really just the tip of the iceberg of what he experienced. But when you have the grace to be able to downplay the pain you experienced, to be able to lift up who Jesus is, then you recognize, I think, you're in the presence of greatness. So this has been a wonderful evening. I hope you're glad you came along to be able to experience them. And I'm going to have Kevin and Julia go to the foyer right now. They have authored a book, as you heard Julia say, 2 Tears on the Window. I've got a copy. I've read it through a couple of times, actually. And the book sells for $20 each. And Kevin and Julia let me know tonight that you could have a special deal. You could buy 2 for $40. And I want to add in a special pastor's deal. You can get 3 for $60. So if you see them at the back there, they'd be more than happy to autograph a copy that you purchase. And again, to be able to buy extras to take and have someone else have them. I love books. If you love books, you want to get this book because you can read it a couple of times. Because sometimes the depth of what they share in that book, it takes more than one reading to actually sink in and go, wow, they actually did experience that. So the ability to meet them and hear them makes the book all the more real. So Thanks for coming along tonight. I'm glad you've been here. When you came in, some of you got cards about High Octane. It's a children's program next Sunday. If you have kids and perhaps somebody invited you to come here and you don't have another church to go to, and you've got kids grade 1 to 6, we'd love to have you next Sunday and experience High Octane. It's a program with skits and games and prizes. Kids love it. And if you know somebody else that would love to be a part of that, that's next Sunday at 11 o'clock right here at Bethel. So again, can I take a moment and just pray for you before you go? I won't be long in this prayer. Lord, thank you for the truth that we've heard through Kevin and Julia. They've been so vulnerable and honest and sincere. Their faith is strong and real. And I just pray that for people that are here tonight and maybe watching online, that are in the midst of a circumstance that Kevin and Julia have helped to see in a different way than in the midst of pain and setback and wondering, where is God? That they would just be open to watching and listening for God at work in their lives, to strengthen them and bless them and give them grace. So thank you for Kevin and Julia. We bless them today, their family, and each one that's here tonight. Pray this in your name. Amen. All right. Well, thanks for being here again. God bless you. Thanks, everybody at the back, all our techies, to make the mic and everything work for us in videos. Thank you.